Fourth Sunday after Pentecost, and Galatians, from the 6th chapter of Galatians, is one of our readings for today. All must test their own work, then that work, rather than the neighbor's work, will become the cause for pride, for all must carry their own loads. Paul's letter to the Galatians is all about freedom. He was fighting off the Judaizers, the people in the Christian church at the time who wanted everybody to follow the Mosaic law, or at least to be circumcised. And Paul basically says, that's not how it works for us. That may be how it works for Jews, but it doesn't work for us, because you have to keep the whole law if you're going to keep the law. And we're not called to the whole law anyway. We are justified by our faith, not by our works, though he's speaking particularly about testing our own works. In other words, asking our works questions about whether we're doing God's work or not. So freedom is we're free to a certain extent from the law, from the Mosaic law, but we're under the law of Christ, which is a justification by faith. Our faith, which is a gift from God, justifies us. We can stand before God through that justification. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, it means that, for instance, on subjects where we're going to have works, particularly thinking right now because of the Supreme Court's nullification of Roe v. Wade, we're thinking about abortion. Abortion does not exist in the Bible. It's not mentioned by Jesus at all. There are some references that sort of snuggle up to it, but not really. Abortion itself is left to our own devices to figure out, and our experience of the Spirit of God within us. That Spirit is what Paul is talking about in terms of testing. We test the Spirit. So, sin, which I like to think of in Augustine's terms of, is disordered love. How is love disordered by abortion? Well, you could say just definitely it's a little hard on the fetus. More than hard. It's death to the fetus if abortion happens. However, where is love in that relationship? Well, before I was a priest, my undergraduate work was in biology, and it has to be said that human childbirth is a rather strange creature. Lots of animals lay eggs, but not too many mammals. Mammals tend to carry their young, although there are probably some mammals that lay eggs that I don't know about right at the moment. But in general, the female of the particular species carries the child. Now, think about that. That offspring cannot support itself outside the body of the mother. Now, what we call that in biological terms is a parasite living off of the body of another. Now, if obviously the pregnancy is wanted, then that's not a parasite. That is a fetus that's going to become a child, potentially, is a human being. I say potentially because while we have all kinds of laws that are not disallowing abortion if there's a heartbeat, well, okay, so blood circulates. Is there any personhood to that? Not really. The heart is not, after all, the organ of personhood. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." It would have been better if he'd said, "I'm aware of myself, therefore I am." In other words, I'm conscious. Consciousness doesn't really arrive for some time, probably mostly after birth. And realistically, think about your own life. You realize you don't remember anything prior to about 4 years old. If you do, it's unusual, but most of us don't. Because to remember something in that sense is to be conscious, to be woke, as we like to say nowadays. The point is, if a pregnancy is not wanted, for instance, a woman is raped or is has incest, she is forced by her family or a member of the family, and becomes pregnant with incest, she may not want that. She may not want that pregnancy. There was a case in Brazil of a 10-year-old who was raped, and the judge wouldn't give her an abortion because in Brazil they have very restrictive abortion laws. And he said, "Well, no, you should carry it to term." Well, she's a 10-year-old girl. On what planet does this particular judge live on? Anyway, be that as it may. The point is, from what Paul says, we have to test what we think is right, and then we have to do what Luther says: go forth and sin boldly. In other words, when you figure out what you think it is that you need to do, then go do it. So it is that in my denomination, the Episcopal Church, we started ordaining women in the 1970s. The earliest ordination of women that I know of is from the 1850s, and that's a Protestant denomination that did that, still does it. So they were way ahead of us. But since then, we also have our leadership, bishops who are women as well. The thing is, it was an argument right up to the time of the first ordination, actually, and even after. And then right up to the time of the first ordination of a bishop who was a woman. The same with a gay man who became the Bishop Robinson, who became the Bishop of Vermont. He was elected by the proper channels, and he was, for 29 years, a member of that diocese, so they know who he was when they elected him. And eventually the wider church, as it can approve or not approve, the wider church approved. And so he became the bishop and was ordained. Well, these things are things that in the denomination, the prophets among us stood up long before we were ready for it and said, we need to do this. and then started working away. And then in the 1970s, like 73, I think, a group of women were ordained by 3 bishops in Philadelphia. And eventually that forced the General Convention to accept women's ordination, which came about in the meeting was in 79, so it was really in the 80s when the first women were beginning to be ordained. So we've had women now for really 5 decades. Seems like a long time in some ways, but in others it has changed the church positively, I'd say. We started doing some of that Me Too stuff really back in the 80s. Began in the 1980s for the Episcopal Church. Now, in no way is the misogyny and patriarchal nature of the church gone completely. And you talk to any of the women who are ordained, and they'll probably tell you stories of prejudice against them. But now we have a woman bishop who stepped in here about the end of last year. And she's wonderful, actually. Diane. She's Bishop Diane. She's actually from California. She was an associate bishop in the Diocese of Los Angeles, and now she's here and doing a wonderful job. We're glad to have her. And we are blessed. But you have to test yourself, as Paul says in Galatians. You have to test, and if in that test you decide this is what you have to do, then you have to go and do it. So that's what we did with women's ordination, and that's what we have done with gay and lesbian clergy, LGBTQ people are welcome. And we're just, we keep testing that idea and realizing that we are doing God's work in our own way. And Paul says you can be proud of that. Now, these are things that Jesus said nothing about. And the biblical witness, when you really dig into it, really isn't much, particularly dealing with gay and lesbian folk. Turns out that the phrases in the Hebrew have been mistranslated since the King James Version, and well, actually even before that. But more recently, they misunderstood what the Hebrew was saying and mistranslated it to focus on homosexual people, which is not meant to. It's actually most of those phrases, there are only 8 of them, in the Bible that are negative about same-sex relations, as we would say. That didn't exist as a term in their day, and they wouldn't have thought of it that way. But if you want to say anything about that, what we understand is that there is no real biblical sanction against gay and lesbian, transgender, queer people. So that is through a period of testing, and believe me, we talked about it quite a bit. The Methodists are going through it now. talking about it, trying to decide what they would do. And of course, the culture is part of the culture is adverse to it, and they don't want to do it. So there will be some kind of schism, I suspect. We lost some people, but most of them have sort of trickled back, realizing that this turned out not to be a radical thing. I think it's important for the church, and it's made some real changes for us. But it's also blessed us with a lot of positive elements that were unexpected. And, well, they were expected in the sense that we knew positive elements would come and blessings would happen, but they've been better than we ever expected. So when we think about Galatians, we think about how we have a responsibility for our actions, our agency, as we like to say, and Paul basically says, take care of your own stuff, and don't worry about what's going on with somebody else. And you can't really take pride what somebody else does, nor judge what somebody else does. You just have to do what you see as God's will in your life. Our understanding of God is not through Scripture alone. It's also through tradition and reason. We use our heads as well. So, for instance, the idea behind birth control is an idea that many of us understand. Our intelligence, our thinking tells us this is a good thing. We are 7 billion. We will probably, in the end of the century, approach 10 billion. All the statistics say that it'll probably taper off at that point, and we won't get much bigger, but still, that's a lot of people. And they all have to be fed and transported and find jobs and all of the things that they need to exist in this world. So, freedom. We've got a lot of it, according to Paul and according to Galatians. And we need to live up to that which is ours to do in our particular life. Anyway, thank you for listening.